The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all of this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at the disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Life is messy. So why would we expect the life of faith to be any different? Abraham, later exalted by Paul as the pinnacle of faith, was far from perfect. You kind of need the whole story. From the beginning of his call, when he was still Abram, a severe famine forced him and his wife Sarai to Egypt for survival. Almost as soon as God calls him, Abram distrusts God's promises and lies to Pharaoh, saying that Sarai is his sister, in order to spare his own life. Sometime later, after God again reiterates the divine promise to Abram and Sarai that they will indeed have children, still they distrust God. At that point, Sarai takes matters into her own hands and tells her husband to sleep with her slave Hagar to give them a son. Centuries later, Abraham and Sarah would find good company with the disciple Peter, the patron saint of putting one's foot in one's mouth. Almost in the same breath as Peter boldly and bravely declares Jesus to be the Messiah, he then tries to get in the way of the work of that Messiah. And there's the seemingly harsh response leveled directly at him, "Get behind me, Satan." And then later, just after this story, on the Mount of Transfiguration, it's Peter who will suggest building 3 tents so they can all camp out and stay, only to be met with another divine rebuke. Poor Peter just can't catch a break. And surely we can't forget his triple denial of ever even knowing Jesus. And yet, for Abraham, for Sarah, for Peter, even in spite of their shortcomings and distrust and failures, God is faithful. Abraham goes on to be the father of many nations. And Peter, witness to the resurrection, is the rock on which Christ builds his church. Did God screw up by calling imperfect people such as these? Or maybe, did God know exactly what God was doing? Maybe God is trying to tell us something about the messy life of faith. Maybe God is showing us that God can use messy and messed up people because God, who is faithful, calls them. The opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty, as Anne Lamott has famously written. Faith doesn't mean having all the answers or having a perfect track record. Faith is full of doubts and questions and uncertainty. And in many ways, that's a lot more faithful than total and unflinching assent to a set of beliefs or doctrine. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me, Jesus says. Jesus' call to discipleship is not a call to blindly follow and to ignore suffering. And to be perfectly clear, taking up our cross is also certainly not a justification for enduring suffering or abuse, as this verse has so often been misused. Taking up our cross, as Jesus calls us, is to embark on a life of faith that is going to be challenging and uncertain and full of questions and missteps and maybe even a little fearful. Taking up our cross calls us into a messy and honest faith. Indeed, taking up our cross calls us to a faith that stands where Jesus did, at the very center of the world's pain, alongside those like 16-year-old Nex Benedict in Owasso, Oklahoma, as they were bullied and attacked in the bathroom at their school just weeks ago, just for being and expressing who they are, and who died the very next day. Taking up our cross calls us to a faith that beholds the very image of God in those who suffer and cry out under the suffocating oppression of racism and sexism, homophobia and transphobia, depression, addiction, abuse. This is a faith that is not afraid to get its hands messy, to dig into the muck and mire of human existence, and to reach out in love. The life of faith is messy and honest, and it will probably leave us with more questions than answers. But it's a life that is no less faithful to the one who calls us, who sustains us, who washes us in the waters of baptism, who nourishes us with bread and cup. We yearn for life to be easy. We yearn for a sanitized faith with a perfect track record. But that's not what faith is about. And there's some grace in that, too. There's a lot of grace in that, actually. Because it is in our doubts and questions and missteps that God calls us anyway, flaws and all. The God of Abraham, the patriarch of Israel who doubted and lied. The God of Sarah, who laughed in the face of God's promises that seemed too good to be true. The God of Peter, who didn't or maybe couldn't understand what it meant for Jesus to be the Messiah. The God of us, imperfect and flawed as we are, but no less beloved members of God's family. We are in good company with our fellow messed up ancestors in faith. We are in good, messy company with each other. If we wait until we have it all together to do the work of the gospel, until the circumstances are just right, until what? And we're going to be waiting a very long time. Jesus calls us to start now, as we are, with the gifts we bring, the experiences we have, the lives we live. Let us now and ever walk with Jesus, because it is God who calls us, God who makes an unbreakable covenant promise with us, God who equips us, and God who sustains us. Let us ever walk with Jesus now, for the sake of the gospel, and for the sake of a hurting world in need of God's justice-making love.